There's a particular kind of tired that doesn't come from lack of sleep. It comes from too much, too many conversations, too many days of being present, being available, being on. And at some point, not dramatically, not with any announcement, you just go quiet. You stop replying as quickly. You cancel the plan. You let the phone sit face down on the table and feel, for the first time in weeks, like you can actually breathe. The people around you might notice. Some will worry. Some will take it personally. And you'll carry a quiet guilt about that, even while knowing, somewhere underneath it, that you needed this. If that experience feels familiar, not as a problem, but as a pattern you recognize, this is for you. Let's begin with the part that rarely gets said directly. When an introvert pulls back from people, from plans, from the general noise of everyday life, it almost never has anything to do with the people involved. It isn't coldness, it isn't indifference, and it isn't always a sign that something is wrong. More often, it's something closer to self-regulation, a return to baseline. The inner world doing what it needs to do in order to function. People who identify as introverts tend to process experience deeply. Social interactions, emotional exchanges, sensory input, these things get absorbed, turned over, and examined. That's not a flaw. It's a trait. And like any trait, it has trade-offs. One of those trade-offs is energy. Deep processing takes more of it. Social engagement draws on internal resources in a way that feels qualitatively different for someone with an introverted temperament than it might for someone who genuinely recharges through connection. So when those resources run low, when the internal tank empties out, the response isn't just fatigue. It's something more specific. A sense of having drifted from yourself. Of needing to find your way back to something quiet and familiar. The disappearing, when it happens, is usually that a return, not an exit. The first thing worth understanding is that the threshold isn't always obvious, even to the person crossing it. There's rarely one conversation that pushes things over the edge. It tends to be an accumulation. The lunch meeting, the evening call, the group chat that never really stops, the family weekend. Each one manageable on its own. But together, over days and weeks, they add up. For someone who processes things deeply, stimulation accumulates differently. Not in a way that's dramatic or clinical, just in the sense that the internal load builds gradually. And the point where it becomes too much can arrive before it's been noticed. What many introverts find confusing about this is that the events that drain them were often enjoyable. It doesn't seem logical to feel depleted by something you genuinely liked. But enjoyment and depletion aren't mutually exclusive. You can have a wonderful evening and still feel completely hollowed out the next morning. One doesn't cancel the other. The disappearing, in those moments, is simply the nervous system asking for a reset. Nothing more complicated than that. When an introvert goes quiet, something is usually happening that isn't visible from the outside. They're processing, not analyzing problems necessarily. It's more that the emotional and social data from recent interactions, tone of voice, unspoken tension, things that were said and things that weren't, all of that needs time and silence to settle into something coherent. Extroverts often process by talking. They think out loud. They work things through in conversation. Introverts tend to work things through in stillness. Silence isn't empty for them. It's where things get sorted. So when someone with this temperament disappears for a few days, they're often not withdrawing from their life. They're catching up with it. Processing the backlog of experience that accumulated while they were busy being present for everyone else. The people around them may see disengagement. What's actually happening is a different kind of engagement, one that's entirely internal and doesn't have a visible form. And when they usually return with more clarity than when they left. Here's a pattern that doesn't get named often enough. After sustained social periods, many introverts don't just feel tired. They carry the emotional weight of their interactions long after those interactions have ended. A difficult conversation doesn't stop when it's over. It continues in the background, replayed, reconsidered, examined for meaning. A comment made in passing 3 days ago might still be processing quietly at the edges of the mind. This connects to one of the more consistent traits of the introverted temperament, a tendency toward depth of reflection, strong pattern recognition, a mind that keeps working even when the external situation has moved on. That's a real strength in many contexts. But it also means social interaction has a kind of afterlife. There's an integration period needed before the slate feels clean again. The withdrawal, understood this way, is simply that integration period. Time for the residue to settle. Space to arrive back at a sense of readiness. You might recognize this in yourself as a need for not just rest, but distance. Even from experiences that were good, sometimes especially from those. There's a subtler cost to prolonged social engagement that doesn't often get discussed. After enough time spent adapting to other people's energy, following the rhythm of a conversation, reading the room, being responsive and present, an introvert can arrive at a quiet place of disconnection from their own perspective. Not a crisis, not a breakdown, just a gentle drift. They start to lose track of what they actually think, separate from what they said in conversation. What they actually want apart from what was socially appropriate. Who they are when no one is watching. Solitude for someone with this temperament is often how that drift gets corrected. It isn't loneliness. It's recalibration. The disappearing in these moments is a return to self. Not dramatic, often not even fully conscious. Just the quiet instinct of a particular kind of mind to find its center again after a period of sustained outward movement. The relief that comes with solitude. The specific relief of not needing to perform or adapt or manage anything can be difficult to explain to someone who doesn't experience it. But for many introverts, it's one of the most genuinely restorative feelings available to them. Something else worth naming is the pressure of constant connectivity. We live in a world where availability is the default. Notifications, messages, social platforms, there's a continuous ambient expectation of presence, of being reachable, of responding within a reasonable window. For many people, this is just background noise. For someone with an introverted temperament, it tends to be a specific and persistent drain. And not just the interactions themselves, the awareness of possible interactions. The low-level mental maintenance of knowing contact could come at any moment. That ongoing readiness takes energy too. So when an introvert sets the phone down and doesn't pick it back up for a day, when they step back from the stream of messages and don't announce why, they may simply be releasing that background load. Creating space in a mind that's been running on full capacity. It isn't avoidance. It's the mental equivalent of closing 12 browser tabs that have been open too long. It's also worth recognizing that withdrawal for many introverts serves a genuinely protective function. Not protective in a fearful sense. More in the sense of preservation. Of maintaining the internal conditions needed to show up well in relationships, in work, in creative life. If you look at when the disappearing tends to happen, there's usually a pattern after a dense social period. Before something that requires full presence, when emotional reserves are running low. When something unresolved has been sitting quietly in the background, the withdrawal has a logic. It's the system doing what the system knows how to do. The introvert who steps back for a weekend isn't abandoning anything. They're doing the maintenance work that makes everything else sustainable. The challenge is that this logic is entirely internal, and from the outside, it can be easy to misread. One more thing, and this one is quiet but important. For many introverts, going silent when words haven't formed yet is simply the more honest response. When the internal experience is still in motion, when something is being processed but hasn't resolved into language, saying nothing isn't avoidance. It's accuracy. The preference for saying something true over saying something incomplete. This can be confusing for the people on the other side of that silence. Silence can feel like a statement, like distance or disapproval. But it's more often just a pause. A moment where the inner life is moving faster than language can follow. When the words do arrive, they tend to be more considered, more precise. Not because the introvert was withholding, but because they were waiting to get it right. The quiet wasn't absence, it was composition. Now here's what tends to get misunderstood from the outside. When someone close to an introvert notices the withdrawal, the natural response is to reach out, to ask what's wrong, to check in. And the introvert, receiving that concern, often doesn't know how to answer. Because nothing is wrong in the way that's being imagined. There's no conflict, no incident, no one to blame. There's just a need for space. A fullness that requires emptying. A quiet that belongs entirely to the internal world, not to any external relationship. The gap between how it looks and what it actually is can create real difficulty. The people who care most are often the ones who feel the withdrawal most sharply and who have the least context to understand it as something other than rejection. You may have spent years trying to explain this. Reassuring people that your distance isn't personal. Finding that the explanation itself requires the kind of energy you withdrew to recover. What most introverts quietly want isn't for people to understand every layer of their inner world. It's something simpler. Just for the people they love to trust that the quiet is not a verdict, that the return is real, and that the person who comes back is, in some small way, more whole than the one who stepped away. There's a reframe that makes the whole pattern easier to sit with. What if the disappearing isn't withdrawal at all? What if it's a different kind of presence, one turned inward instead of outward? The introvert who goes quiet isn't gone. They're somewhere else, somewhere without a public address. A place that doesn't translate easily into conversation, but is nonetheless real and full and active. The capacity to go there, to recognize the need, to honor it without excessive guilt, to come back from it with something renewed, is not a flaw in the introverted temperament. It's one of its quieter, less celebrated strengths. Your need for space doesn't require justification. It doesn't require an apology. It requires understanding, first from yourself and, in time, from the people you choose to keep close. You don't have to be more available than you are. You just have to know yourself clearly enough to stop pretending otherwise. And if you've made it this far in this video, there's a reasonable chance you already do. Thank you for spending some quiet time here. And if something in this resonated, if it helped name something you've been carrying for a while, then it did what it was meant to do. Take the space you need. Come back when you're ready. This is the Conscious Introvert, where quiet minds awaken.